Welcome back. Hello friend, about 85% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you also don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comment. I thought camping in the rain would be peaceful. Just me, the sound of raindrops on the tent, and the quiet forest around me. I'd always liked the way rain made everything feel calm. But by the middle of the night, I realized I'd made a big mistake coming out here alone. The rain started in the afternoon, soft at first, then quickly turning heavy. By the time I set up my tent, everything was already soaked, including me. Inside the tent, I tried to dry off, but it was useless. The air felt wet, and my sleeping bag and clothes felt damp no matter what I did. I pulled out my small camping stove to make some tea and warm up, hoping it would make me feel better. But the sound of the rain hitting the ground kept pulling my attention. Something about it felt off. It wasn't just the rain. It felt like there was movement out there, small noises in between the drops. I tried to ignore it. It's the forest, there are always animals around. As it got dark, the rain finally eased up, but the silence that followed wasn't comforting. Normally, there would be sounds of frogs or crickets, maybe a rustling in the bushes. Tonight, there was nothing, just the sound of water dripping from the leaves. I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the quiet. It felt heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then I started hearing it, soft crunching sounds, like footsteps on wet leaves. Every time I sat up to listen, the sound stopped. I kept telling myself I was imagining it. Then I heard it, a scraping sound, low and sharp, metal on metal. My chest tightened as I thought of my car, parked just down the trail. If someone was messing with it, I couldn't just ignore it. My car was my only way out of here. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The rain had started again, light but steady, making it hard to see. The beam from my flashlight bounced off the wet trees, but beyond it, everything was pitch black. I didn't want to leave the tent, but I had no choice. I threw on my rain jacket and stepped outside, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I tried to walk quietly as I made my way to the trail that led to the clearing where my car was parked. When I reached it, I froze. The driver's side door was open, and I could see a figure moving inside the car. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. My heart pounded as I ducked behind a tree. My breath came fast, and I tried to stay as quiet as possible. The rain covered some of the noise, but I could hear them. They were going through my things. I felt trapped. I couldn't confront them. I had nothing to defend myself with, and I was completely alone. But if they messed with the car, I'd have no way to leave. After what felt like forever, the person stepped out of the car. I could barely see them, just a dark shape with a hood over their head. They didn't run. They just walked calmly back toward the trail, disappearing into the forest. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before I moved. My hands were shaking as I made my way to the car. The inside was a mess. My backpack was open, my wallet and phone were gone, and my car keys weren't on the seat where I'd left them. I ran back to my tent. Locking myself inside like that would somehow help. I grabbed the small camping knife I always kept with me, holding it tight as I tried to think of what to do. I knew I couldn't stay there. Whoever that was could come back. The night felt endless. Every sound made me jump, and I kept looking at the tent's zipper, terrified it would move. When the first light of dawn came, I wasted no time. I packed up what little I had left and started walking the trail back to the main road. The hike was long, and every few steps, I found myself looking over my shoulder. The forest looked empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It took most of the day, but I finally made it to the road. My legs were sore, and my whole body felt heavy from the fear and exhaustion. When I saw a car coming, I waved it down, nearly crying with relief when it pulled over. I climbed in, thanking the driver over and over. I hadn't even noticed the backpack sitting on the floor until we'd driven a few minutes. My backpack. I froze, my stomach twisting as I stared at it. The driver noticed and smiled, their eyes cold and unblinking. "You shouldn't be out here alone," they said, their voice flat and quiet. I didn't respond. My eyes flicked to the lock on the door. It was already down. The car didn't stop for a long time. I got hired to help a team studying dangerous snakes in a desert. It sounded like an exciting change from my usual boring routine. I wasn't a snake expert or anything, but my job seemed simple. Help set up camp, write down what we found, and collect samples when needed. The desert was huge, empty, and quiet, but it felt like it was alive in a strange way. The heat made the air shimmer, and the dry ground seemed to move in waves. We set up camp near a dried-up riverbed. The team leader warned me to always be careful since snakes were common around here. Our tent had medical supplies, including antivenom, just in case. For the first couple of days, I was super cautious, double-checking my boots and watching every step I took. But after a while, I got used to it and started feeling more comfortable. The work kept me busy, and I even started to admire how quiet and still the desert was. On the fourth night, I woke up to a faint noise outside my tent. It sounded like something moving through the sand. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it got louder. I grabbed my flashlight, sat up, and froze. Part of me didn't want to know what it was, but I knew I had to check. I unzipped the tent a little and shone the light outside. My heart sank. A long, thick snake was sliding past my tent. Then I saw another and another. The light from my flashlight showed at least 4 snakes moving silently through the camp. They weren't just any snakes. These were rattlesnakes, their patterns clear as day. I slowly zipped the tent back up and sat there, heart pounding. But that's when I realized I wasn't alone inside the tent either. I turned the flashlight, dread filling me. In the corner, coiled tightly, was a massive rattlesnake. Its rattle buzzed softly, a low, dangerous warning. I didn't move a muscle. My breathing slowed to short, quiet gasps, and sweat rolled down my face. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I knew the antivenom was in the supply tent, but getting there felt impossible. Outside, the noises grew louder. I peeked through a small gap in the tent flap and saw snakes everywhere. They were slithering between our supplies and crawling over our gear. It was like the ground itself was alive. The team leader had mentioned that snakes sometimes moved in groups when looking for water, and it hit me we had camped right in the middle of their path. I had to decide: stay in the tent and risk getting bitten by the snake inside, or try to make it to the truck parked about 50 feet away. The truck felt like my only real chance. I moved slowly, inching toward the tent door. The rattlesnake stayed still, but its rattle got louder, filling the tiny space with its eerie sound. My hands shook as I unzipped the tent just enough to slip out. Outside, my flashlight lit up the ground. It was covered with snakes, dozens of them, their bodies writhing and gliding through the dirt. I stepped out carefully, trying not to disturb any of them. Each step felt like a lifetime. I could feel my boots brushing against their cold, scaled bodies as I moved. My eyes stayed glued to the ground, making sure I didn't step on one by mistake. The truck was so close, but it felt like it was miles away. Finally, I reached the truck. My hands fumbled as I grabbed the door handle. For a moment, I thought it was locked. My heart nearly stopped, but then the door opened. I climbed in, slammed it shut, and locked it. I sat there shaking, watching the chaos outside through the windows. Snakes were everywhere, sliding over the tents, tangled in the supplies, completely taking over the camp. I stayed in the truck until the first light of dawn. As the sun rose, the snakes began to disappear, vanishing into the desert as quickly as they had come. I got out, my legs trembling, and went back to the camp. It was destroyed. The tents were torn open, supplies scattered all over. It looked like a storm had ripped through. I gathered what little I could, left most of the stuff behind, and drove away without looking back. Later, the research team confirmed we had set up camp on a migration route, a mistake that could have easily cost me my life. I never returned to the desert after that. Even now, every time I see an empty field or a patch of sand, my chest tightens. I know snakes don't think or plan, but that night felt different. They didn't just pass through. It felt like they had taken over, like we were the ones trespassing in their world. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that faint rustling in my mind, and I wonder if the snakes are out there, waiting for me to step into their path again. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a solo camping trip in the Australian mountains. I needed a break from the constant noise of the city, and this seemed perfect. The weather report said there'd be some light rain, but I didn't mind. I thought it'd make the experience more relaxing. I found a nice spot near a ridge, surrounded by tall eucalyptus trees. The view of the valley below was beautiful, even as thick clouds started to cover the sky. The air smelled fresh, like wet dirt and leaves, as I set up my tent. By the time I got inside, the rain had started, just a light tapping on the fabric. Felt peaceful. As night fell, the rain got heavier. The soft tapping turned into a loud drumming, and the wind began to shake the tent. I expected some of this. Camping isn't meant to be totally comfortable. But the cold started creeping into my sleeping bag, making it hard to relax. I kept telling myself this was all part of the adventure and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime after midnight to a strange noise. It wasn't the rain or the wind. It was deeper and farther away. At first, I thought it was thunder, but it didn't stop. It sounded like something big was moving in the distance. My heart started racing as I sat up and listened. The sound got louder, and soon, I could hear rushing water mixed with it. I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight outside. Muddy water was everywhere, pouring down the slope toward my tent. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. A flash flood. I'd set up camp too close to the slope, and now water was rushing down, carrying sticks, leaves, and even small rocks with it. Panicked, I needed to move fast. I grabbed my flashlight and tried to pack up, but my hands were shaking so much I couldn't get it together. The sound of the rushing water grew louder, almost like a roar. Then I heard something worse. Sharp cracks and snaps like trees breaking. I scrambled out of the tent, slipping in the mud as I tried to get away. My flashlight beam shook wildly, lighting up the chaos around me. That's when I saw it. A huge tree had fallen across the slope above my campsite. It was holding back a massive pool of water. I froze, realizing what would happen next. If that dam of water broke, it would rush down the slope and take everything, including me, with it. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to climb higher, slipping and sliding in the mud. The rain was coming down so hard it felt like needles on my skin, and every step felt like a struggle. I looked back just in time to see the dam give way. The floodwater surged downhill, tearing through my campsite like it was nothing. My tent, my gear, everything I brought with me, it all disappeared in seconds. I kept climbing, grabbing at the muddy ground with shaking hands, until I reached a rocky ledge. I crouched there, soaked and freezing, watching as the flood roared past below me. The sound was deafening, and the sight of it made my stomach churn. I stayed there, holding onto the rock, until the rain started to ease just before dawn. When the sun finally came up, the world looked completely different. My campsite was gone, replaced by a mess of mud, broken trees, and debris. My tent and gear were nowhere in sight, probably swept far down the valley. I sat there for a long time, trying to catch my breath. My whole body ached, and I felt empty, like I just barely escaped something I didn't fully understand. As I got ready to hike out of there, I couldn't shake one thought. If I'd waited even a few minutes longer to move, that water would have taken me, too. It wasn't just the flood that scared me, it was how fast everything had changed. One moment I was safe in my tent, and the next I was running for my life. I thought I had control, that I was just camping and enjoying nature. But out there, alone in the mountains, I wasn't in control of anything. Nature doesn't care if you're ready or not. It doesn't care if you survive. The world out there is bigger, stronger, and faster than we ever realize. And in that moment, it made sure I knew just how small I really was. We went camping because my grandmother loved being in nature, and my wife thought it would be a good way for us all to spend time together. We picked a quiet spot by a lake. It was far enough from other people to feel private, but not so far that we couldn't leave quickly if we needed to. The evening was warm, and the sounds of crickets and the soft breeze in the trees made it feel peaceful. The first night was uneventful. My wife and I set up the tent while my grandmother sat by the fire, humming softly and staring out at the dark water. She looked happy, like she was remembering all the camping trips she used to take years ago. The next day, we kept busy. We took a short walk, gathered some firewood, and spent time fishing by the lake. The area was very quiet. At first, it felt relaxing, but after a while, it started to feel odd. There weren't any birds chirping or small animals rustling in the bushes. It felt like the whole forest was still, almost like it was waiting for something. My wife mentioned how quiet it was, but we didn't think too much of it. Maybe it was just the time of year. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, my grandmother started acting different. She kept glancing over her shoulder toward the trees, her face tense. I asked if she was all right, but she just waved her hand and said she needed to stretch her legs. She slowly wandered off toward the lake while I added more wood to the fire and my wife worked on dinner. After a while, we realized she hadn't come back. I grabbed a flashlight and called out for her. The light from the fire didn't reach far, and beyond it, everything was pitch black. My wife stayed by the campsite while I walked down to the lake, shining the flashlight along the edge. That's when I saw her. She was standing in the water, her feet just barely covered, staring out across the lake. Her hands were shaking. I led her back to the camp, trying to figure out what she'd been doing. But she didn't say anything. She just shook her head, looking at the ground. That's when I noticed her shoes. They were covered in thick, wet mud, the kind you'd only find in the swampy parts of the woods on the far side of the lake. There was no way she'd gone that far in the time she was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound seemed louder. The crackle of the fire, the faint ripples of the lake, even my wife's steady breathing. I kept staring at the tent's zipper, half expecting something to pull it open. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to a loud snapping noise. It was close, too close. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The fire was still glowing faintly, casting long, flickering shadows on the trees. My wife and grandmother were both sound asleep, so I stepped out carefully. The snapping sound came again, louder this time. It sounded like a large branch breaking. I turned the flashlight toward the woods, and my stomach dropped. A man was standing just beyond the trees, right at the edge of the light. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. He wasn't dressed for camping. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he wasn't wearing shoes. His skin was pale, almost gray. He didn't say anything, didn't make a sound, but his eyes never left mine. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like my chest would burst. Slowly, I backed into the tent and zipped it shut. I didn't want to wake my wife or grandmother. For the rest of the night, I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't sleep either. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside, hoping it had all been a bad dream. But near the fire pit, I saw footprints. Bare, human footprints, leading away from the campsite and into the woods. We packed up right away. My grandmother didn't say a word the whole drive home. She just sat in the back seat, staring out the window with that same tense look she had the night before. Later that night, as I was unloading the car, I realized something was missing. My grandmother's walking stick. She always used it, but it wasn't there. I thought about it all night, replaying everything in my head. Early the next morning, before anyone else was awake, I checked the mud on her shoes. It wasn't the same mud from the swampy woods. It was dry, dusty, like the kind you'd find on an old dirt road. I had been working as a forest ranger for 6 years, and this wasn't the first time I'd been called to help with a search. But this time, it wasn't for a lost camper or hiker. This time, we were after a criminal, someone dangerous, wanted for serious crimes. Knowing someone like that was hiding in the woods gave me an uneasy feeling. Most people don't realize how easy it is to get turned around out here or how thick the trees can get. But someone desperate, someone trying to avoid being caught, that kind of person could be trouble. We started early in the morning. A team of officers and rangers set up a base camp deep in the forest. My job was to check certain areas, mark spots with flags, and report back. It felt different from the patrols I was used to. Every noise seemed louder. Every shadow between the trees seemed to move. I couldn't shake the feeling that the guy we were after might be watching us, hiding nearby, waiting to see if we got too close. By midday, I was sent to search an area near an old, overgrown trail that hadn't been used in years. It was thick with brush and branches that scratched at my jacket. The farther I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just silence. Even the air felt heavy, thick with the smell of wet dirt and rotting leaves. The only sound was my radio, where occasional updates from the team came through. After about 2 hours, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. A small clearing appeared in front of me, and in the middle of it was a fire pit that had been partially covered up. Around it, trash was scattered. Empty cans, crumpled wrappers, and the torn remains of a sleeping bag. Someone had been here and not too long ago. I reached for my radio to report it, but before I could call it in, I saw something else. Boot prints in the dirt, heading deeper into the trees. I decided to follow the tracks. Slowly, I tried to keep my steps quiet, but every crack of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. The trees grew closer together as I followed the trail, and the light filtering through the branches got dimmer. My breathing felt loud in the silence. After what felt like forever, the tracks stopped near a rocky hill. For a moment, I thought I'd lost them, but then I noticed something. A small, dark opening at the base of the rocks. It was a cave just big enough for someone to crawl into and hide. I crouched down and listened, trying to hear if anyone was inside. Nothing. I thought about waiting for backup, but the idea of letting this guy slip away made me keep moving. I gripped my flashlight tightly and got my bear spray ready, just in case. As I got closer to the cave, a strong smell hit me. A mix of sweat, wet earth, and something metallic, like rust. It made my stomach twist. I shined my flashlight into the cave. At first, it just looked empty, but then the beam landed on a backpack shoved into the corner, with clothes spilling out of it. Next to the bag was a knife lying in the dirt. My heart started racing. I didn't see anyone, but it felt like someone was watching me. The silence was unbearable. Backing away slowly, I kept my eyes on the cave. I scanned the trees around me, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then, behind me, I heard it, a branch snapping. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I didn't wait. I turned and ran back toward the clearing, gripping my radio as I called in what I'd found. My voice shook as I described the scene, the cave, and the belongings inside. The team responded fast, setting up a perimeter and searching the area, but we never found him. By the time the officers swept the cave and the woods around it, he was gone. All we found were his things, the backpack, a few empty food wrappers, and that knife. It was clear he'd been there, probably watching me the entire time I was near the cave. That night, I stayed at the base camp. Couldn't sleep. Every little noise outside the tent made me jump. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. It all sounded like footsteps. I kept thinking about that moment in the clearing, the snap of that branch. He had been close. So close. I've done plenty of patrols since then, but that day stuck with me. Sometimes, when I'm out in the woods alone, I get that same feeling, that someone is watching me from the trees. I tell myself it's nothing, just my imagination. But then I remember the tracks, the cave, the branch snapping behind me. And I wonder if he's still out there, hidden in the forest, waiting for someone else to come too close. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. My sister, my dog Daisy, and I were just looking to get away from everything for a couple of days. We found a quiet spot near a small lake, hidden deep in the woods, about an hour from town. There was no one around for miles, just trees, the occasional bird flying by, and the calm sound of the water. Felt like the perfect place to relax. Daisy was off exploring, sniffing around and running in circles. My sister was busy setting up the tent, and I started collecting firewood. That's when I heard something strange. It was a crack, like a branch snapping. It didn't sound like it came from any of the trees around us, though. I looked around but saw nothing. I figured it was just a squirrel or some animal in the woods, so I didn't think much of it. Then, things started to feel off. Daisy suddenly stopped what she was doing. She stood still and started growling low and steady. She was staring into the woods, not moving an inch. I felt a cold shiver down my back, but I tried to ignore it. It's probably just a squirrel or something, I thought to myself. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. As the sun set and the light started fading, we made some food. I kept glancing around the trees, the darkening forest feeling more and more strange. Daisy's growling didn't stop. In fact, she started pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. It wasn't like her to act this way. It made my stomach turn, but I kept telling myself that everything was fine. Then I heard it again, a soft shuffle, like footsteps moving through the brush. But it wasn't the usual sounds of animals. It was slower, like someone was carefully walking around, taking their time. I looked over at my sister, but she didn't seem to hear anything. Her back was to the woods as she tended to the fire, unaware of the tension in the air. My heart was starting to race, but I didn't want to freak out my sister. I grabbed Daisy's leash and clipped it on quickly, trying to calm her down. My hands were shaking as I walked over to my sister, trying to act normal. "Let's just finish up here," I said. "We'll be fine." But inside, I wasn't so sure. Something was definitely wrong. The wind picked up, shaking the leaves, but it didn't help me shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to focus on the fire, but it didn't help. That's when Daisy went completely silent. She stood there, staring into the dark woods, her eyes locked on something I couldn't see. I turned to look, but the woods were just a wall of darkness. Nothing moved. Then I heard the shuffle again, but this time, it was closer. "Did you hear that?" I asked my sister, but she didn't even look up. She hadn't heard it. It felt like the air around us was getting heavier, as if something was in the woods, watching, waiting for something. My skin felt tight, and I could barely breathe. I grabbed my sister's arm and told her, "We need to leave. Now." She didn't argue. She could feel it too. The air thick with something we couldn't see but knew was there. We hurried, gathering up our things. As we packed, I could have sworn I saw something move in the shadows just outside the light of the fire. A tall figure, but before I could even fully focus on it, it disappeared into the dark. My heart was pounding as we rushed to the car. I kept looking over my shoulder, my senses on edge, but I didn't see anything. As I started driving away, I felt a strange relief, like I could finally breathe again. But then, as we passed the last curve in the road, something made my blood run cold. The headlights briefly lit up a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just outside the reach of the trees. It was standing perfectly still, staring directly at us, its shape clear against the darkness. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel, the car's tires crunching on the road. But even as I drove farther, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. I don't know who or what it was, but I can't forget that moment, that feeling of being watched. And what's worse, I'm pretty sure it wasn't the first time they'd been watching. It felt like they had been waiting for us to find that spot, to camp there. And whatever it wasn't done with us yet. It was just getting started. We'd been talking about this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a quick break, just a way to get away from work for a bit. My brother-in-law, Jason, had invited me along, and somehow he managed to talk my boss, Mike, into coming too. I didn't really know what to expect, but I thought it'd be a good way to escape the daily grind and just relax with family. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any towns or even other campers. It was quiet, really quiet, surrounded by tall pine trees and thick bushes. I had been here before, but it had been a long time. The stillness was almost too much, but I figured that was just the nature of being out in the wild. We set up camp, spent some time fishing, and took a walk along a creek nearby. As night came, we sat around the fire. The sky above was dark, full of stars, and the only sounds we heard were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air started to get colder, and I could feel the chill creeping into my bones. Jason was making jokes about how we might be the only ones out here, but he stopped mid-sentence when we heard something. A twig snapped far off in the trees. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just some animal, but Mike tensed up beside me. I could see him glancing nervously toward the woods. We kept going with our campfire activities, but I could tell Jason wasn't his usual confident self. He kept looking over his shoulder, like he thought someone was watching us. The fire dimmed, and the night air felt colder, heavier. That's when it happened. A rustling in the bushes, followed by a low growl. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. The noise was way too close. My heart started pounding. I looked around, but all I could see was the light of the fire flickering. Jason stood up quickly, grabbing a flashlight. Mike followed, his eyes wide, scanning the trees. I just stood there, frozen, feeling every muscle in my body tense. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It wasn't an animal. It was something bigger, a shadow darting quickly between the trees. I couldn't breathe for a second. What was that? Jason took a step toward the shadow, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The shadow quickly moved behind a tree and vanished into the thick woods. We all stood there, quiet, our fear settling in. After a long moment, Jason mumbled something about heading back to the truck. We started grabbing our things, moving fast but trying not to make noise. My heart was thudding in my chest, and I could hear the sound of my breath in my ears. The shadows in the trees seemed to be moving with us, always just behind us, as we hurried to leave. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck. The headlights lit up the dark, and we threw everything into the bed of the truck, not looking back once. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, like something was still out there, watching us. As we drove away, I glanced out the window. The trees seemed to close in around the campsite, and the shadows grew longer and darker. I looked at Jason and Mike, both of them staring straight ahead, their faces pale and tense. No one said anything. We didn't need to. We all knew that whatever it was out there, it wasn't just some animal. Something had been following us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled into something we weren't supposed to find, something that didn't want us there. The further we drove, the worse the feeling got. I looked out the window again, trying to shake it off, but there was a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. It felt like the darkness itself had reached out to us, and I couldn't help but feel that whatever we had felt out there, it wasn't over. We didn't talk about it again. Not once. I don't think any of us could even put it into words. But I kept thinking about those trees, the way they seemed to move, the way the shadows didn't act like shadows. Something had been out there, and whatever it wasn't finished. I felt that it was still out there, waiting. I'll never forget that night. And every time I drive past a patch of dark woods, the feeling creeps back. That sense of being watched, of something not quite right. It stays with me even now. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I hear twigs snapping in the distance, like it's following me. It might be years since we left, but that feeling hasn't gone away, and I don't think it ever will. I'm a 19-year-old living in Tucson, Arizona. This incident happened roughly 6 months ago during an overnight hike in the Mesquite Mountains, located about an hour's drive southeast of Tucson. I'm deliberately avoiding naming the exact trail for reasons that will soon become clear. Over the years, I've learned that sharing trail details online can lead to an influx of people who bring trash, loud music, and general disrespect for nature. The trail I chose for this trip was an 8-mile loop through a canyon, a straightforward in-and-out hike meant to last just one night. Initially, I had planned to go with a friend, but they bailed at the last minute. With my backpack ready and the car loaded, I decided to go solo. After starting late and getting turned around on some rough dirt roads, I didn't reach the trailhead until around 5:45 p.m. For those unfamiliar with hiking, starting this late is a big mistake. I had a 4-mile hike to my planned campsite, and the sun was setting fast. I figured if I hurried, I could cover at least 2 or 3 miles before I'd need to stop for the night. This decision led to me hiking alone in near total darkness, with nothing but my headlamp for light. The trail was surrounded by dense trees and brush, and the nearest road was 15 miles away. Hiking alone at night in such isolation is unnerving. The deeper I went, the darker it became, until the only thing I could see was the patch of ground illuminated by my headlamp. That's when I realized it was time to stop and set up camp. With only my headlamp lighting the way, I found a less than ideal spot to camp. There were remnants of an old fire ring and some charred wood, suggesting that others had camped there before, though not recently. I quickly set to work gathering dry wood, started a fire, and put up my tarp. Once everything was settled, I cracked open a can of beef stew I'd packed for dinner. The firelight was comforting, and the uneasy feeling I'd had during the hike began to fade. However, the tension of being alone in such a remote place lingered slightly. To help you understand what happened next, let me describe the campsite. It was a small clearing encircled by tall pines, with the trail about 25 feet to my left. When you have a fire going in the wilderness, it creates a bubble of light, beyond which everything is pitch black. I was sitting near the fire, eating my dinner, when I suddenly noticed a small rock a little larger than a pebble, land inside my camp. I froze, staring at it in disbelief. I was almost certain I was the only person on the trail that night. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the direction the rock had come from, but the thick trees and brush limited my visibility to about 10 feet. I spent the next 15 minutes anxiously scanning the area, straining to see or hear any signs of movement, but found nothing. I convinced myself that the rock had somehow fallen from above or that I'd accidentally kicked it. Trying to shake off my nerves, I returned to the fire and stayed alert for the rest of the evening before finally going to bed. Later that night, I was startled awake by the faint sound of rustling leaves. Still groggy, I listened as the sound grew fainter, as if whatever was making it was moving away. I reached for the small flashlight I'd left beside me when I fell asleep, but it was gone. I started to panic, scanning the area with my headlamp. About 15 feet away, past the tree line, I spotted my flashlight lying in a pile of leaves. My stomach dropped. The flashlight had somehow been moved from where I'd left it to a spot well beyond the edge of my camp. Heart racing, I quickly slipped on my boots, grabbed my knife, and tried to decide what to do. Should I stay in camp and hope for the best, or risk a 3-mile hike back to my car in total darkness? I decided that staying put was the safer option, reasoning that whoever or whatever was out there would have an advantage if I was out on the trail without proper light. The footsteps came back. At first, they were faint, as if someone was casually strolling through the woods. Sometimes the sound would fade away entirely, only to return an hour or two later. This continued for what felt like hours, each time growing closer. Eventually, the steps were only about 7 feet away. By then, my fire had burned low, and I was out of wood. The footsteps stopped, and everything went completely silent. For the next 2 hours, I sat frozen, clutching my knife and waiting for something to happen. It wasn't until the first light of dawn that I finally felt safe enough to move. I packed up my camp as quickly as possible and started the 3-mile hike back to the trailhead. When I reached my car, parked on an empty dirt road, I sprinted to it, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I was 20 miles away. I stopped at a gas station in a small town on the way back, mostly to calm my nerves and talk to another person. As I walked back to my car after buying a drink, I noticed something written in the dust on my rear window. Sleep tight. This was by far the most unsettling experience I've ever had in the outdoors. I don't know who or what was out there with me that night, but I strongly urge anyone considering hiking in the Mesquite Mountains to think twice. When I was 15, I went camping in a remote part of western West Virginia, where much of my mom's family owned small cabins. It was a secluded area on private land, and everyone living on the mountain was some kind of relative. Growing up, we spent our summers there, sitting around campfires, sharing spooky stories, and playing with cousins. To explain the setting, imagine a big capital T representing the main road. About 150 feet past the top of the T was a river. If you went left along the road, you'd pass several relatives' houses, but the road eventually ended in thick forest. To the far right of the T was my mom's small cabin, where we usually stayed. I often liked to wander off on my own, enjoying the peace and quiet. On this particular day, my aunt decided to tag along. She was 15 years older than me, with bright purple hair, tattoos, and almost 6 feet tall. Not the type to scare easily. She admitted she wanted to come along so she could smoke a joint without my grandma seeing her. Even though she offered, I was a good kid and turned her down, still too afraid of drugs to try them. We decided to head left into the dense forest. At the end of the road, there was a rough dirt path that led deeper into the woods, with the river running about 150 feet downhill. If you followed the path far enough, you'd find one of those strange, abandoned staircases that people sometimes talk about. I walked ahead, staying near the riverbank, watching the fish dart around while my aunt lagged behind, enjoying her high. I was lost in my thoughts when I suddenly heard a click. Snapping back to reality, I looked around and spotted a man standing on the opposite side of the river, no more than 20 feet away. He must have just stepped out of the woods. It was summer, but he was wearing a heavy black jacket and worn-out jeans. In his hands was one of those old yellow cameras where you have to wind it up to take another picture. I froze, startled. I had never seen anyone around this area who wasn't family. The man smiled at me, then slowly lifted the camera and took another photo. He looked to be in his 40s, tall and thin, with a scruffy appearance. He stepped closer to the water, and I instinctively stepped back, nearly slipping on a rock. At that moment, my aunt stumbled out of the trees mid-sentence, high as a kite, and immediately went silent when she saw him. I glanced at her, then back at the man. He wasn't even looking at her. His eyes stayed locked on me. He wound the camera again, pointed it at us, and took another picture. Then he made a motion that chilled me to my core. He raised a finger to his lips in a shoot gesture, then pointed to a sheath on his belt, which appeared to hold a knife. Finally, he dragged his finger across his throat in a slashing motion. Without thinking, I turned and bolted through the trees, grabbing my aunt as I ran. My heart was racing, and I was certain I heard one last click before the sound of splashing footsteps followed behind us. I didn't stop to check. The river wasn't very deep where we were, only about thigh-high for an adult, so it wouldn't have slowed him down much. I ran blindly, adrenaline pushing me forward as my aunt stumbled after me. We finally reached the abandoned stairs, and my aunt yanked me to the far side, crouching down beside me as we tried to catch our breath. I clamped my hand over my mouth to muffle my wheezing and listened intently. Though I couldn't see the river through the dense trees, I could hear branches snapping, as if someone was moving through the forest. Panic surged through me. The trail back to the family cabins wasn't straightforward. It wound through uneven terrain, full of rocks and steep dips, where it would be easy to trip or twist an ankle. On top of that, the area was known for snakes, but staying still felt like an even worse idea. I tried to convince myself to move, but fear had me paralyzed. My aunt grabbed my arm, whispering that we had to keep going. I didn't make it far before I tripped over a branch and slammed headfirst into a tree. Dazed, I tasted blood. I'd bitten my lip in the fall. My aunt crouched beside me, frantically trying to get me to stand up again. I could barely think straight, but the urgency in her voice snapped me out of it. We pressed on, stumbling through the woods, until finally, we reached the road leading to my grandmother's cabin. By the time we arrived, I was sobbing uncontrollably. My grandma took one look at us, covered in scratches and terrified, and immediately yelled for my grandfather, who grabbed his rifle and rounded up the other men on the mountain. While the men searched the woods, my mother showed up, and she wasn't convinced. She thought my aunt's drug use had made us paranoid and that we'd overreacted to a random fisherman who had wandered too close. My aunt angrily defended me, insisting I hadn't smoked anything and that the man was real. They argued until my grandmother intervened, telling them both to stop. Despite the search, no one found any sign of the man. That night, for the first time anyone could remember, every cabin on the mountain was locked tight. To this day, I wonder if I became part of some eerie collection of photographs. Still, considering what might have happened if I'd been alone, I think I can live with that. It was 1997 when this happened. A close friend of mine invited me on a camping trip. I hadn't gone camping since I was about 13, so I thought it would be fun and agreed. I was so excited about it that I barely slept the night before. Early the next morning, around 5:30 a.m., he picked me up, and we drove about 90 miles to the park. During the ride, I managed to catch a little sleep, so I felt slightly better by the time we arrived. That's when my friend broke some unexpected news. We'd have to hike another 2 hours to get to the campsite. I tried to talk him into picking a closer spot, but he insisted this one was worth it. Reluctantly, I followed him, feeling a bit less enthusiastic. At first, the hike wasn't so bad. The trail was mostly downhill and I was keeping up just fine. But after a while, I started to feel sluggish. We paused for a quick break about halfway there, but before I knew it, we were back on the trail. The second stretch was much harder, mostly uphill, and I was soon dragging my feet and barely paying attention to where I was going. We reached a flat area, and I felt relieved. My friend, walking ahead of me, somehow missed the hazard, but I wasn't so lucky. One moment I was trudging along, and the next, I was falling into a deep hole. The impact when I hit the bottom was so jarring it woke me from my daze, and the rush of adrenaline blocked most of the pain at first. When I tried to stand, my right leg buckled, and I collapsed onto a sharp stick sticking up from the ground. Looking around, I realized there were more stakes scattered at the bottom of the hole, though some had been knocked over. I looked down and froze. My shin bone was poking through the skin. Instinctively, I pulled the stick out of my leg, and the pain made me feel even more nauseous than I already was. The hole was deep, at least 10 feet, and the blue sky framed by trees told me I wasn't climbing out on my own. I yelled for my friend, who soon appeared at the edge of the pit. He was laughing at first, thinking I'd just taken a tumble, but his expression changed to panic when I told him how badly I was hurt. He explained it looked like some hunters or poachers had dug a trap for large animals, and I had fallen into it. I thought he might be able to pull me out, but that wasn't going to work. Next, he tried reaching me with a long tree branch, but the pain in my leg was too intense for me to stand, let alone climb. It became clear I wasn't getting out without outside help. The ranger station wasn't too far away, just over an hour's walk from where we'd started, so I told my friend to go get help. It was still early, so I wasn't too worried. Once he left, I was alone with nothing but the throbbing pain in my leg. The pain came in waves, and the nausea wasn't helping. I thought about making a splint, but almost passed out when I tried to tighten it. Leaving my leg alone seemed like the best option. I sat there with my head between my knees, waiting for the dizziness to pass. Eventually, it did, and I tried to distract myself by singing to keep my spirits up. That worked until I noticed the sky darkening. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and before long, rain started falling. At first, it was just a drizzle, but it quickly turned into a downpour. I figured getting wet wasn't a big deal, but I hadn't thought about the water pooling in the hole. Before I knew it, my feet were submerged. I clawed my way up the wall to stay as upright as possible, silently praying for the rain to stop. After what felt like forever, the storm eased up. The water level had only reached about halfway up my shins, so I thought I'd be fine if it kept raining at that pace. Unfortunately, it wasn't over. The rain came back even harder. The water rose faster, and my focus shifted from my injured leg to staying calm. I tried to keep my mind off the situation by thinking of funny memories and jokes. Still, the hours dragged on, and the fear of drowning in that pit crept into my thoughts. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, help arrived. By the time they pulled me out with ropes, the water was nearly at my waist. I can still feel the panic when I think about how close I came to drowning out there. The ride to the hospital flew by. After surgery to insert some screws and plates into my leg, I was sent home. The next 8 weeks on crutches felt like an eternity, but I was grateful to be alive. My friend and I never did get a chance to redo that camping trip. But over the years, I've taken my kids camping a few times, and I always make sure to be extra cautious. Maybe it's time to give my old friend a call. We haven't talked in years. A camping trip might be a good way to reconnect, though I'll be sure to watch my step this time. Growing up was anything but easy. It wasn't so much about constant physical abuse, though there was some of that. My parents mostly ignored me. Both had serious drinking problems. My mom worked part-time, claiming it was so she could be there for her kid. In reality, she spent most of her time either drunk or asleep. My dad, the main provider, worked long-haul trucking jobs and was gone for most of the time. That left me alone to fend for myself. We lived on the outskirts of a small town, our apartment surrounded by endless stretches of forest. I was fascinated by those woods for as long as I can remember. Soon enough, I began spending most of my days wandering through them, losing myself in nature. Over time, I realized my parents didn't seem to notice or care when I came or went, so I started camping overnight in the woods, curious to see if they'd miss me. They didn't. Encouraged by their indifference, I began staying out for days at a time. Those woods became my sanctuary, but as all good things do, it eventually came to an end. One early morning, as I was sneaking back home, my dad caught me. He had just returned from a trip, and seeing his 12-year-old son stumbling out of the woods at dawn on a school day set him off. He gave me a whipping and a long lecture. My mom joined in too, shouting at me for being irresponsible. Of course, that didn't stop me. After keeping a low profile for about a week, I waited until my dad was on the road again and my mom was drunk. Once she was passed out, I slipped out the door and back to my haven in the woods. Every morning before school, I'd sneak back into the apartment without anyone noticing. Life quickly returned to the way it had been before. In those days, I had a handful of camps scattered across the forest. Early on, I discovered I wasn't the only one using the woods. Groups of homeless people had set up makeshift camps there, likely long before I ever did. They used the forest as a place to drink and use drugs, far from prying eyes. Once, I stayed in one spot too long and nearly got attacked by one of them. After that, I moved my camps to the other side of the river where I felt safer. Some nights, I'd hide in the shadows and watch the homeless folks. They were often drunk or high, fighting with each other, which only deepened my dislike for them. Their behavior reminded me too much of home. I avoided them as much as I could, always staying on my side of the river. One hot summer afternoon, I was down by the river getting water when I heard voices in the distance. I kept quiet and stayed alert. As I was walking back to my camp, I heard yelling on the other side of the river. I crouched down and watched from the bushes. There was a shabby tent set up nearby, with 3 men and a woman shouting at each other. They were too far for me to make out much of what they were saying, but it was obvious they were drunk. One of the men suddenly hit another over the head with a glass bottle. The injured man staggered and fell. I waited for him to get up, but he didn't. The attacker then picked up a large rock and dropped it on the man's body. He did this several times, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming. The others stood by, watching as if this was nothing unusual. Finally, the woman yelled something and slapped the attacker's chest. After a moment, they all ran off together. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like hours, afraid they might come back. When I finally decided it was safe, I stepped out. The man on the ground wasn't moving. Despite my fear, I felt like I had to do something. He was still a person, no matter what. I ran the 3 miles back home as fast as I could. To my surprise, my dad was home. Breathless, I burst in and told my parents what I had seen. Rather than helping, they started yelling at me. My dad accused me of disobeying him, and my mom said I was making up stories for attention. When I insisted I wasn't lying, my dad pulled off his belt and whipped me until I started crying. He told me to stop making things up and to shut up before I gave him something to cry about. Afterward, I crawled to my room and cried myself to sleep. My trips to the woods ended after that. My parents wouldn't let me leave the house without supervision. Not long after, they decided I was too much to handle and sent me to live with my grandfather. I expected life with him to be just as bad, if not worse. But to my surprise, Grandpa Mac turned out to be kind and patient, unlike any adult I had ever known. He asked me what I liked to do, something no one had ever cared about before. Fighting back tears, I told him about my love for the outdoors. Instead of laughing at me, his face lit up. He told me stories about camping trips he had taken with his dad. That spring, we began exploring the forests and parks together. He taught me more about nature than I ever thought possible. Years later, when I finally told him about the incident in the woods, he hugged me tightly and urged me to report it to the police. Following his advice, I did, and the weight of guilt I had carried for so long was finally lifted. The police later found the woman involved. She led them to the man's remains, helping close a decades-old case. Now, as an adult, I realize my parents' failings weren't my fault. I've built a life around my love for nature, traveling the world and working to preserve wild places. None of it would have been possible without my grandfather's love and guidance. I owe him everything. The rain had been coming down for hours by the time Jackson and I finally got to the campsite. The forest road was a muddy mess, and my truck slid more than once on the way in. I thought about turning around, but I was already halfway there. Driving back in the dark on those slippery roads didn't seem like a good idea either. Jackson, my Labrador, wagged his tail like crazy as soon as I parked. He loved the smell of wet dirt and trees. His excitement kept me going, even though I was starting to regret the trip. I found a flat spot near the trees and started setting up the tent. The rain was soaking through my jacket, and my hands felt clumsy as I worked. The sound of raindrops on the tent tarp was steady, almost calming, like it was closing us off from the rest of the world. By the time I finished, the sun was gone, and the forest was just dark shapes all around us. I thought about making a fire but decided against it. Everything was too wet, and it didn't seem worth the effort. Instead, I climbed into the tent with Jackson, ate a quick sandwich, and tried to settle in. Jackson lay next to me, his body warm against mine, while the rain kept its steady rhythm. Something felt wrong after a while. Jackson usually slept like a rock, but not that night. He kept sitting up, sniffing at the tent flap, and then lying back down, only to do it again a few minutes later. At first, I thought it was just the new smells of the forest or the sound of the rain throwing him off. I told myself he'd relax soon enough. Then I heard it, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping, followed by a faint rustling. My heart jumped, but I tried to stay calm. Could have been anything, a deer, maybe even a bear, but it sounded far away. Still, Jackson sat up straight, his ears up and his eyes locked on the tent flap. He wasn't wagging his tail anymore. He was stiff, watching and waiting. The next sound was closer, wet leaves crunching, slow and deliberate. My stomach sank. That wasn't an animal. It sounded like someone taking careful steps, trying not to be heard. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a little. I shined the light out into the rain. The beam lit up the empty clearing, and the rain made it hard to see anything beyond the edge of the trees. Everything was still, except for the rain dripping off branches. I told myself I was being paranoid, but Jackson didn't relax. He stayed sitting up, his body tight and alert. Then I heard breathing, slow, heavy breathing, just beyond the edge of the light. My chest tightened, and my grip on the flashlight turned my knuckles white. Jackson let out a low growl, his fur standing up. He was staring at the same spot, but no matter how much I moved the light, I couldn't see anything. The breathing stopped suddenly. The silence was worse than the sound. The rain kept falling, but everything else felt too quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stayed frozen, not sure if I should run or stay put. Jackson's growl faded into a soft whimper. I'd never seen him scared before, and that made my fear even worse. After what felt like forever, I heard the crunch of leaves again. This time, the sound was moving away, back into the trees. The steps were slow and steady, like whoever or whatever was out there wasn't in a hurry. I stayed completely still, listening until I couldn't hear it anymore. I didn't sleep. Every rustle, every change in the rain's pattern, sent my heart racing. Jackson stayed close to me, his body tense and his ears twitching at every sound. When the sun finally started to rise, I packed up as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, and I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see someone or something watching us. As I drove out, the muddy road felt like it was pulling me back to safety, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I didn't see anyone, and I didn't hear anything else, but the silence in the forest stayed with me. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed the scratches on the back of my truck. Long, deep marks like someone or something had run their nails down the side. My heart sank and my stomach turned. I knew they hadn't been there before the trip. Now I can't stop thinking about that night. Someone or something was out there watching us, maybe even waiting, and they wanted me to know it. I had been working as a woodcutter for a year, clearing out dead trees and cleaning up the forest to help prevent fires. The job was tough, but I liked it. The peace of the woods, the steady swing of my axe, and the pile of logs at the end of the day made it all worth it. To save time driving, I had started camping near the worksite during the week. It felt practical and gave me a chance to enjoy the quiet even more. That morning began like every other. The air was cool, the forest smelled fresh and earthy, and everything at my little campsite was just as I left it. I had set up my tent a little off an old dirt road, far enough to stay out of sight of any hikers but close enough to reach my truck quickly if needed. After eating a simple breakfast, I grabbed my tools and walked to the area I was scheduled to clear that day. I had been chopping trees for hours when something caught my eye. One of the marked trees I was supposed to take down had deep scratches running across the trunk. I hadn't noticed them earlier, and they definitely weren't from my tools. The marks looked like they were made by claws, big ones. Bears sometimes scratch trees, but these were different. They were deeper and wider, and they didn't seem random. It was like something had been trying to tear the tree apart. I felt a little uneasy but brushed it off. Weird things happen in the woods all the time. Still, as I kept working, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every now and then, I'd glance around, thinking I saw movement between the trees, but there was never anything there. The forest felt strange, too quiet. No birds, no breeze, just the sound of my axe hitting wood and the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. By the time afternoon rolled around, I decided I had done enough for the day. My pile of logs was ready for pickup, and the uneasy feeling hadn't gone away. I started walking back to my campsite, eager to call it a day. When I got close, I froze. My tent was down, flattened against the ground. At first, I thought it might have been the wind, but as I got closer, I saw that all my stuff was scattered around. My sleeping bag was ripped apart, my water jug was knocked over and empty, and some of my food was gone. But the worst part was my axe. It was gone. I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing. Whatever did this wasn't a bear or a raccoon. Bears don't take axes. My hands started shaking as I grabbed my backup hatchet from my pack, gripping it tightly. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. That's when I saw it. Something moving in the trees. It was quick, just a blur, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. Something or someone was watching me. couldn't stay there. I turned and ran as fast as I could toward my truck, not caring about the noise I was making. The whole way back, I could hear something following me. Heavy steps, twigs snapping, branches rustling. Always just far enough behind that I couldn't see it. I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to get to my truck and get out of there. When I reached the dirt road and saw my truck, I almost cried with relief. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the still trees. I reported everything to my boss the next day. They sent a team out to check, but they didn't find anything. No tracks, no signs of a bear, no explanation for the damage to my campsite. They told me I must have imagined it or overreacted. I never went back to that spot. Couldn't. Every time I think about it, I remember the feeling of being watched, the strange scratches on that tree, and the sound of something following me. I don't know what it was, but I've learned one thing. The forest isn't as empty as it seems. There are things out there that don't leave tracks. Things that don't want to be seen but let you know they're there. And if they decide to notice you, all you can do is hope they lose interest. I worked as a border guard in a remote area deep in the forest. It wasn't the usual kind of border. This place was part of a protected zone. My job was to make sure no one crossed the border illegally or hunted animals they weren't supposed to. The shifts were long, quiet, and a bit creepy at times, but I didn't mind being alone. At least not in the beginning. One weekend, I was told to spend the night near an old watchtower deep in the woods. The tower had been abandoned for years, and they only sent me because there were reports of people sneaking around, maybe hunters, maybe smugglers. My instructions were simple. Keep an eye out and report anything strange. That evening, the forest was oddly quiet. Too quiet. Even as the sun went down, there were no sounds of birds or insects. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was just imagining things, and focused on setting up my tent a short distance from the watchtower. By the time it was dark, the forest was pitch black. The only light came from my flashlight and the dim outline of the watchtower in the distance. The air was colder than I expected, so I started a small fire to stay warm. As the hours passed, I began to hear soft rustling sounds far off in the trees. I figured it was animals at first, but the sounds didn't feel random. They seemed to move closer, then farther away, like something or someone was circling my camp. By midnight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to check around the area with my flashlight. As I walked through the trees, I found signs that someone had been there not long ago. Cigarette butts, a torn plastic bag, and faint boot prints in the dirt. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. My chest tightened as I tried to radio it in, but the signal was weak. I managed to give my location and say what I found before the static took over. When I got back to my camp, the fire was out, and my tent had been slashed open. My backpack was gone. I froze, shining my flashlight around. Whoever did this must have been watching me the whole time. I hadn't heard or seen anything. I didn't bother with the tent anymore. I climbed up into the old watchtower, thinking it would be safer and give me a better view of the area. The climb was tough, and the old tower creaked and groaned with every step. At the top, I found an old cot and a rusted stove. It wasn't much, but it felt better than staying on the ground. I stayed awake as long as I could, but eventually, I dozed off. I woke up to the sound of footsteps below. My heart was pounding as I crouched down, listening. The steps were slow and heavy, moving directly under the tower. Then they stopped. I held my breath, too scared to move. Whoever it was didn't call out or try to climb the ladder. They just stood there. I didn't dare look over the edge, and after what felt like forever, The footsteps finally started again. They faded into the distance, but I didn't feel any safer. When the sun came up, I climbed down carefully and went back to the camp. My gear was scattered everywhere, like someone had searched through it, but nothing important was missing. That's when I noticed the tracks again. Boot prints leading away from the camp, deeper into the forest. I followed the tracks for a little while until they stopped near a large tree. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of where the person went. It was like they had just disappeared into thin air. I didn't want to stay any longer. I grabbed what was left of my things and called for someone to pick me up. It took hours for the patrol team to reach me, and by the time they did, I felt completely drained. I told them what happened, and they promised to look into it, but I knew they didn't believe me. I've been on plenty of shifts since then, but I've never gone back to that watchtower. I can't forget the feeling that night, the way whoever was out there seemed to know exactly what they were doing. They weren't just wandering through the forest. They were watching me, studying me, and I don't think they were alone. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those tracks that stopped by the tree, and I wonder, if they didn't leave the forest, are they still there watching someone else now? Or are they waiting for me to come back? I still remember that camping trip like it was yesterday, though I kind of wish I didn't. My wife had been encouraging me to get out of the house, do something, maybe feel a bit more like myself again. Ever since I retired, life felt empty. After more than 30 years as a cop, I went from dealing with all kinds of rough situations every day to just nothing. The house was quiet. My days were slow, and I felt like I had no purpose. Camping sounded like a way to break that, to get out of my own head for a while, maybe find some peace. I picked a spot way out in the woods, miles from anyone else, where I wouldn't hear anything but nature. I packed light, just a tent, a flashlight, some food, the basics. I drove up north to a small lake in the woods and set up camp right by the water. It was peaceful, with the cool air and the sounds of the forest. I took a deep breath, hoping this was what I needed. The quiet out there was so thick, only broken now and then by leaves rustling or a bird calling. I thought I'd enjoy that kind of silence, but the more time passed, the stranger it felt. The quiet was too deep, like everything was holding its breath. That first night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, wide awake in my tent, telling myself it was just the new place, the cold, maybe some leftover nerves from years on the job. But the feeling I had in my gut, that something was off, wouldn't go away. In all my years, I'd learned to trust that feeling. But I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. By the second night, that feeling had only grown. I kept hearing little noises, like sticks breaking, leaves rustling a bit too close to camp. It wasn't the usual animal sounds. I know what those sound like. This was slower, like someone creeping around, moving carefully. I stayed on edge, listening hard, eyes fixed on the edge of the trees, but I didn't see anything. Finally, I dozed off, though it wasn't real sleep, just a light, uneasy rest. But in the early hours, right before sunrise, I jolted awake, and instantly, I felt it. Something was wrong. I felt exposed, like someone had been watching me. My skin crawled, and I got up, checking my surroundings. That's when I saw them, footprints all around my tent. They circled the camp, close enough that someone had been walking there while I slept. Deep boot prints, not animal tracks, not some hiker passing through. These were fresh, and they led off into the woods, disappearing in the trees. Whoever it was had been right up on my camp, watching me. I felt a chill that ran down my spine. I'd never felt so vulnerable. I wanted to stay calm, to keep my wits about me, but my instincts were screaming to get out. I quickly packed up camp, all the while feeling like someone was watching me from the trees. Every tiny sound felt louder, like whoever had been there was still close, waiting, watching. I didn't look around. I just focused on packing and getting to my truck. Finally, I broke through the edge of the forest and saw my truck parked just where I'd left it. I felt a bit of relief, telling myself maybe I'd imagined it all, that maybe the tracks had been from an old camper who wandered by. But as I got closer, my heart dropped. Something was wrong. Right there on the hood of my truck, smeared in thick mud, was a single word, alone. I froze, staring at it. Whoever had been out there hadn't just watched. They'd followed me. They wanted me to know that out here in the deep woods, I was on my own. No help, no backup. I looked around, scanning the trees one last time, half expecting to see someone standing there, but I saw nothing. The forest was empty, just as silent as it had been before. I climbed into my truck, hands shaking, and started the engine. My heart was pounding, and I didn't stop driving until I was hours away, well out of the woods. But even then, that feeling didn't go away. I felt like someone had marked me that day, that they were out there still, knowing I'd seen their message. I haven't gone camping since. And to this day, whenever I'm alone, even in my own home, I get this feeling sometimes. It's like eyes on my back, just for a moment, reminding me of those words on my truck, reminding me that, no matter where I am, someone knows where to find me if they want to. We were deep in the forest, moving slowly and carefully through thick trees and brush, trying to stay quiet. The job was simple on paper. Find and capture a wanted criminal hiding out here. He was dangerous, armed, and he knew these woods well. This part of the forest was huge and untouched, almost like it kept secrets nobody was supposed to know. Our team had set up a small, hidden camp a few miles back, near a river that gave us fresh water and some cover. At night, we only used red flashlights, keeping the beams low so we wouldn't be seen. It was pitch black under the trees, the kind of darkness where you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Every sound felt louder. Every snap of a twig sounded like a warning. The forest was alive around us, animals moving in the shadows, leaves rustling, distant calls that seemed to follow us wherever we went. On the second night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I knew it wasn't just my team out there. Something else was in the woods, watching us, following our every step. I could feel eyes on me with every breath I took. By dawn, that feeling only grew. Even the air felt different, thick and heavy, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. We split up into pairs, each pair covering a different part of the area, moving slow, watching every step. My partner and I were making our way along a narrow trail when I noticed something strange. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, signs that someone had passed through recently. We followed the trail, inching forward until we came upon a small clearing. That's when I saw it. There was a small, rough shelter, barely visible in the shadows. It was hidden well, almost too well. As we got closer, I could see marks on the ground around it. Footprints, though not fresh. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, leaving behind a half-burned fire and some scraps. My gut told me this was the criminal's hideout, and he hadn't gone far. I signaled to my partner, and we started searching the area around it. We spread out, moving in a slow circle around the shelter, looking for signs of where he might have gone. Suddenly, a quick movement caught my eye, just a flicker of something in the corner of my vision. I turned, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. We kept moving, every step careful and slow, the silence pressing in on us. The forest seemed to close in, each shadow stretching longer as the day faded. Then, from somewhere close, there was a soft crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. My heart raced as I scanned the trees, every sense on high alert. And then I saw him. The criminal was crouched low, hiding between trees not far from us. He was watching us, eyes sharp and wild, his hands tight on a weapon. In that moment, Everything felt frozen, like we were caught in some kind of standoff. I could see it in his face. He was ready to fight, and he wasn't going to be taken easily. Without a word, I backed up slowly, signaling to my partner to do the same. We moved quietly, trying not to make a sound, hoping to get enough distance to regroup with the others. But as we turned to leave, another noise came, a low, scraping sound from deeper in the shadows. I glanced back and felt a chill go through me. More figures were stepping out from the trees, rough-looking men with cold, hard eyes and weapons in hand. They weren't part of our team and they weren't locals. In that instant, I realized this was much bigger than one criminal hiding out in the woods. This was a group, maybe even a whole ring of criminals who had set up here, and we'd walked right into their ground. They'd been watching us from the moment we entered the forest, tracking our every move, staying one step ahead. The single criminal we were after had just been bait, a way to lure us deeper in. We turned and ran, moving as fast as we could, dodging through the trees, with the sound of footsteps following close behind. Branches hit my face, and I could hear my own breath, fast and heavy. I knew we had to reach the camp, but the forest felt endless, every tree looking the same, every path starting to blur together in the fading light. When we finally broke through the trees into the clearing where our camp was, it was empty. The rest of the team was nowhere to be seen, and all our gear was gone. It was like we'd never even been there, like the forest had swallowed every trace of us. I looked at my partner, and I could see the same realization in his eyes. We were alone, and no one was coming to help us. We'd been led into a trap, far from any way out. The forest around us felt alive with silent, watching eyes, and as night fell, I felt the walls closing in, like we were animals being driven into a corner. The darkness grew thicker, and we were forced to face the truth. Out here, we were already forgotten, just like the others who had come before us. We were the next ones who would disappear into this forest, leaving nothing behind but broken branches and silent shadows. And the worst part was nobody would ever know what really happened to us. It was late September, and I decided to take my dog, Rusty, on a weekend camping trip in the mountains. The forest was thick and damp from the earlier rain, and clouds were hanging low, covering the stars and moon. By the time we set up camp, it was pitch black, and a light rain started falling again, making the ground soft and slippery with mud. We set up our tent in a small open spot surrounded by trees. The air smelled like wet leaves and dirt, and I could barely see past the small circle of light from my flashlight. Rusty, usually brave and always on alert, stayed close, his eyes darting toward every little noise in the dark. Around midnight, the rain started coming down harder, tapping against the tent in a steady rhythm. I was starting to doze off when Rusty suddenly tensed up, staring toward the edge of the trees and letting out a low growl. I picked up my flashlight and aimed it in the direction he was watching, but all I saw were thick, dark branches. I figured it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, but Rusty wouldn't settle. He kept growling, his eyes fixed on that one spot. A few minutes passed, and I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest. I thought Rusty would calm down, but his growl turned into a full, deep bark. His gaze was locked on the same place, just outside the light, and my heart started racing. I grabbed the only thing I had for protection, a small knife, and peeked out of the tent. The rain had eased up a little, but thick fog was rolling in, sticking close to the ground. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any noise, but all I could hear was the sound of water dripping from the leaves. Still, something felt wrong. I couldn't shake this feeling creeping up my spine. Then I heard it, a slow, heavy crunch of footsteps on the wet ground. They were slow and steady, coming closer, one step at a time. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest. I scanned the trees with the flashlight but saw nothing. Rusty's barking grew louder and more panicked, his body tense, his fur standing up. I wasn't about to stick around and find out who or what was out there. I quickly grabbed my bag, stuffed everything into it as best I could, and pulled up the tent stakes. We'd packed light, so we were ready to move within minutes. Rusty stayed close to me as I tried to find our way out, his barking turning into a low, steady growl. As we walked, I kept hearing the sound of those footsteps behind us. They'd stop whenever we stopped, just far enough that I couldn't see anything, like someone was keeping pace with us. I knew it wasn't an animal. Animals don't follow you like that. This felt different, like we were being watched, tracked. We kept moving through the thick fog, trying to stay on what I thought was the trail back to my truck. But with every step, it felt like we were getting farther away, like the forest was swallowing us up. I started to wonder if we were just walking in circles, getting more lost by the second. My nerves were shot, and Rusty was now walking close to my side, no longer barking, just letting out a small whimper now and then. After what felt like hours, I finally caught a glimpse of something metal through the trees. The truck. I nearly ran the last few steps, Rusty right by my side. I yanked open the door, letting Rusty jump in first, then climbed in and slammed the door shut. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life, breaking the silence of the forest. As I backed up to turn around, my headlights swept over the trees one last time. For a split second, I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light, half hidden behind a tree. It was a person, completely still, drenched in the rain, just watching us. Their eyes were locked on mine, unblinking, almost like they'd been waiting for us to leave. I hit the gas and sped down the mountain road, not looking back again. I drove until the forest was far behind us, but that feeling didn't go away. It stuck with me, the sense that we'd been followed, watched. Even now, I can't shake it. Sometimes, when I'm out late or walking through a dark place, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that same figure watching me. And every now and then, Rusty still tenses up at night, staring at the shadows by the window, growling at something only he can see. I went camping with a few friends in a forest far from any town. It was a place none of us had been to, but we'd heard it was beautiful and untouched, with no trails or signs of people around. The plan was to get away from everything for a bit, just relax by the fire and enjoy nature. The first day went smoothly. We set up our tents, collected firewood, and spent the evening cooking and chatting by the fire. It was quiet, no other campers, just the sound of the wind in the trees and small animals scurrying through the bushes. By nightfall, it got cold, so I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and lay down to sleep. I was just starting to doze off when I felt something lightly brush against my ankle. At first, I thought it might be a thread or maybe a bug. I was about to brush it off, but when I moved, I felt something smooth and cold tighten a little around my leg. Suddenly, I realized that this was no loose thread or bug. I froze, barely breathing, as I felt the thing in my sleeping bag shift a bit, heavy and long. As I moved just slightly, it coiled tighter, wrapping around my leg. My heart was pounding hard, and my mind raced. I couldn't see it, but I didn't need to. I knew what it was. I'd heard stories of campers finding snakes in their tents, and we were far from any help. I knew one bite could be enough to end it all out here. I lay there, barely breathing, afraid to make the slightest move. My leg was starting to go numb from how tightly it was coiled around me. Every tiny shift I made seemed to make it grip even tighter, wrapping itself slowly but firmly around my leg. I knew I had two options: stay completely still and hope it wouldn't bite, or try to ease out of the sleeping bag and risk making it attack. I decided to wait. I told myself that snakes usually bite only when they feel threatened. Time dragged by as I lay there, counting every second, each shallow breath. My body was aching from staying so still, but I couldn't risk it. I just lay there, trying to keep my breath shallow, praying that it would leave. Finally, I felt it start to loosen just a little. Slowly, it relaxed its grip on my leg. I stayed frozen, hardly daring to breathe, until I felt it fully unwind and slide down my leg. I waited until I was sure it was gone, then unzipped my tent and crawled out as quietly as I could, my whole body tense with fear. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat by the fire, watching the woods around me as the first light of dawn crept over the trees. My leg was sore and marked where it had been wrapped, and my mind couldn't stop running through what might have happened if I'd moved too fast or startled it. In the morning, as the light hit, I found a faint track leading away from my tent, showing where it had slithered off. I quickly started packing up, not caring if my friends asked questions. They saw my face and started packing too. We didn't talk much, each of us feeling the unease in the air, looking down with every step, expecting something to move. As we left, I realized something that I hadn't wanted to face out there in the dark. That snake hadn't just been passing through my tent by accident. No, it had been there for warmth, lying against me like I was part of its territory. I'd thought it was a lucky escape, but as I walked away, I kept thinking, what if it came back? What if it decided that warmth was worth hunting down? Even now, lying in bed at home, I feel a prickling on my leg, remembering that cold, heavy grip. And I know deep down that in the middle of the night, far out in the wild, there's no such thing as luck, only what the forest chooses to let you walk away with. Jack was a friend of my dad's, a real outdoors guy who'd been camping and fishing his whole life. When he invited me to go camping, I felt excited but a little uneasy. Jack wasn't the friendly, cheerful type. He was more serious and no-nonsense, and he wasn't the kind to slow down for anyone. So I knew I'd have to keep up. We set off for a remote part of the woods where he swore the fishing was good, and the campsites were quiet. After what felt like hours of walking, we finally reached the spot he'd chosen. It was deep in the forest, far from any trails, and surrounded by thick trees and bushes. Out there, it was so quiet that you could barely hear anything but the wind and the occasional rustling. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and spent most of the day fishing at a stream nearby. Jack barely spoke, totally focused on his fishing, and I just followed his lead, getting used to the stillness around us. When the sun started going down, we cooked the fish we'd caught over the fire and ate in silence. The quiet was starting to feel almost normal, and I was beginning to feel more relaxed. After dinner, Jack told me to make sure my tent was zipped up tight before we went to sleep, which I did. I got into my sleeping bag and lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest around us. Leaves moving in the wind, insects chirping, and once in a while, a branch cracking somewhere off in the dark. At some point in the middle of the night, a strange noise snapped me awake. It was a slow, steady crunching sound, like someone was carefully stepping on dried leaves and twigs. At first, I thought it might be Jack, but the footsteps sounded careful, like they were trying not to be noticed. I lay completely still, barely breathing, listening as the sound got louder, then stopped right outside my tent. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the air was pressing down on me. I could hear my heartbeat thudding in my ears as I stared at the thin walls of my tent, waiting to see a shadow or something move. But there was nothing, just complete silence and an eerie feeling that someone was right outside, watching. After what felt like forever, I finally managed to pull the zipper open just a tiny bit to peek outside. In the dim moonlight, I could make out Jack's tent across from mine, undisturbed. No one was there, no signs of anything strange, just the sound of leaves rustling lightly in the breeze. I forced myself to believe it was probably just some animal and tried to fall back asleep, though I barely closed my eyes for the rest of the night. The next morning, Jack was sitting by the fire, calm as ever. He didn't say anything strange, and I didn't bring up what I'd heard. I didn't want to seem paranoid. We packed up and went back to the stream for another day of fishing. But as we walked down, I noticed something odd, footprints in the soft dirt along the path. They were definitely human but didn't belong to either of us. The tracks looked strange, as if whoever left them had been moving carefully, stepping lightly. I tried to brush off the feeling crawling over me, but I couldn't shake it. Even as we fished, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like there was someone watching from the trees. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I saw Jack's eyes moving over the tree line more than once, but he never said anything. When evening rolled around, Jack suggested we pack up and head back to the car instead of spending another night out there. He didn't explain, and I didn't question it. We packed up quickly, hiking back in complete silence. When we finally reached the edge of the trail, close to the car, I felt a wave of relief. But just as we were about to get in, something made me look back. There, standing in the shadows of the trees, barely visible in the fading light, was a figure. They were wearing dark, torn-up clothes, and they blended almost completely into the trees. But what I could see were their eyes, locked on us, unblinking, just watching. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, half hidden in the shadows, as if waiting for something. Jack didn't look back. He tossed our gear in the car and motioned for me to get in. As we drove away, I kept my eyes on that figure until the trees finally hid them. Jack kept his mouth shut the entire ride back, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I never talked to Jack or my dad about that camping trip. Part of me wondered if Jack had seen the figure too, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Whatever was out there, it didn't feel like we were supposed to see it, like maybe we'd accidentally walked into a place we didn't belong. To this day, I can still picture that figure in the shadows, just standing there. It felt like a warning, something telling me that some places, some people are better left alone. And every now and then, when I'm out in the woods, I get that same feeling, like someone's watching from the trees, waiting, and I know it's time to leave before they step any closer. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my grandmother, and my grandfather camping at the same spot we'd been to so many times before. It was always peaceful, a break from the noise and rush of the world. The sound of the fire crackling, the fresh air, and the quiet that came with being out in nature. I always looked forward to it. We set up camp near the lake just like we always did. The spot was tucked between a few trees, and the water was only a short walk away. It was one of those cool, clear evenings where everything felt still, too still. My grandparents got to work making their usual campfire stew while I walked around, stretching my legs after the long drive. The sun was sinking behind the hills, casting a golden glow over everything, and everything felt like it always did, until it didn't. As night fell, I noticed something strange. There was a noise coming from the trees, not the wind, but a soft rustling. It wasn't normal. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just some animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then, I heard it again, this time much closer. It sounded like someone was walking through the leaves, crunching them with every step. My heart started to beat a little faster, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went back to the campfire, trying not to let my grandparents see that I was bothered. They were busy talking and cooking, not paying any attention. But the noise didn't stop. Now, it was clearly footsteps, slow, careful, almost like they were trying not to be heard, moving around our camp. My skin crawled. I looked around the trees, trying to see something, anything, but all I saw were shadows. The only sound was the soft hum of my grandmother near the fire. Then I felt it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. It was a feeling like someone was watching me, studying me. Every part of me screamed to run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen. Then the footsteps stopped. Everything went quiet. Too quiet. No wind, no animals, nothing. The silence stretched on and on. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A figure, just a shape in the darkness, standing near the edge of the trees. At first, it was just a shadow, so faint I wasn't sure I saw it at all. But then it moved, just a little, like it was turning to face me. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was a person. I felt my heart race. The figure didn't move forward. It just stayed there, staring. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes off it. My instincts told me to run, but I stayed put, paralyzed by fear. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, never blinking, never looking away. I could feel the weight of its gaze, pressing down on me, but I couldn't look away. My whole body screamed at me to go, but I couldn't make myself move. It wasn't until what felt like an eternity that the figure finally turned and walked off into the trees. Couldn't breathe. I didn't know if I should run or stay, but all I could do was stare at the darkness where it had disappeared. It wasn't until later that I realized what really scared me. It wasn't just that there was someone out there. It was that they had been completely silent. Not a single branch snapped under their feet. Not even a leaf crunched. They had moved like a shadow, and I hadn't heard a thing until they were already close. I didn't say anything to my grandparents. They were already asleep, unaware of the strange thing I'd just seen. But all night, I lay awake, listening to every sound in the woods, convinced that someone, or something, was out there. I kept hearing small rustling sounds, like someone walking around just beyond the campfire light, but I never saw anything again. I couldn't sleep, not with that feeling of being watched. In the morning, I didn't want to stick around any longer. I told my grandparents I wasn't feeling well, and we packed up and left early, my grandparents still completely unaware of what had happened. Years later, I returned to that same lake. The trees were still there, the water still as calm as I remembered, but something was different. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood there for a while, staring at the trees, feeling the same fear creep up my spine, the same sense that something was waiting just out of sight. The place had changed, but the feeling hadn't. As the evening grew darker, I couldn't shake the thought that whatever had been out there that night, all those years ago, was still out there, watching, waiting, and I wasn't so sure that it was something I could escape. It was a quiet night at the police training camp, about a few miles outside the city. A group of us had set up tents for some night exercises. The forest around us was thick, with trees so dense they blocked most of the moonlight, casting everything in shadow. The air was cold, and all I could hear were the sounds of the fire crackling and the occasional chirp from distant animals. We'd spent the day doing various drills, and now it was time for a night exercise. This one was about tracking and moving quietly through the woods. I was paired up with a few other officers to find a suspect who had a head start. Our instructor, an experienced officer, had warned us that the exercise wouldn't be easy. We had to catch the suspect without making a sound and without disturbing the forest. We split up and moved slowly through the trees, making sure to keep our flashlights off. We had to rely on our instincts and the dim light from the stars above. The instructor had told us that things wouldn't always go as planned, but I didn't think much of it. To me, it was just another training session. As we moved deeper into the woods, I started feeling like something was off. It was as if someone was watching us. I kept looking behind me, but there was nothing there. I ignored the feeling and focused on the task. We were supposed to look for signs of the suspect, broken branches, footprints, anything that would lead us in the right direction. But as we walked, I noticed there were fewer and fewer signs. About an hour into the search, I saw something odd. There were footprints in the dirt, but they weren't from the suspect. These were smaller, almost like children's footprints. My heart started to race. I was trained for this kind of work, but this felt wrong. I radioed my team, but the radio didn't work. I tried again, but nothing came through. I decided to follow the footprints, my mind racing with questions. We were far from any roads, deep in the woods, and no one was supposed to be out here. My flashlight barely lit up the ground in front of me. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of insects and animals were gone, and it felt like the world around me had gone completely still. Then, I heard a rustle from behind a nearby bush. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen closely. There was another rustle, this time much closer. I lifted my flashlight, but when the beam hit the spot where I heard the noise, there was nothing there, just trees and thick underbrush. I stepped back, feeling uneasy, and turned to head back to my team. But then, I saw something in the distance, a figure standing still in the shadows. It was tall, way too tall to be one of my team members. Panic shot through me. My training kicked in, and I grabbed my radio again, but all I heard was static, with faint, broken words that I couldn't understand. I didn't waste any more time. I needed to get back to camp. Fast. As I turned to run, I could feel something behind me. It was too close now. The rustling sounds were growing louder, and the air felt heavier with each step I took. My flashlight flickered, and I struggled to keep the beam steady. I was breathing hard, my legs burning from the effort, but I kept running, not daring to look back. The figure I had seen earlier was still there, but it wasn't moving like a person anymore. It was too fast, too quick, like it was closing in on me. I crashed through the underbrush, my foot catching on branches and roots. I finally burst through into the clearing where the camp was set up. My team was standing by the fire, just as I had left them. They hadn't moved an inch. I quickly glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure behind me, but there was nothing there. No movement, no shadow. It was as if whatever it was had never been there at all. I tried to shake it off. It was just a trick of the mind, I thought, just stress from the exercise. But something didn't sit right. I couldn't ignore the feeling of being followed. The next morning, when we gathered to go over the exercise, I told the instructor about what had happened. He didn't seem surprised. He just nodded and told us to stay sharp. The mind can play tricks out here, he said, but I didn't believe him. I knew what I had seen, and it wasn't just in my head. Later, as we were packing up to leave, I walked to the edge of the camp, trying to shake off the unease. That's when I saw them, small footprints in the dirt, leading into the woods. They were fresh, like someone had just walked through, and they were too small to be from any of my team. They led right into the trees, exactly where I had been running the night before. My blood ran cold as I stared at the footprints. They weren't a part of the training. They weren't part of the exercise. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, that maybe someone else had been out there, but the feeling that had crept into me the night before came rushing back. The woods weren't just quiet. They were waiting for something or someone to walk through them again. Something that might not be human. I left that day without saying another word, but as we drove back to the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, and I knew, deep down, that whatever it was in those woods wasn't finished with me yet. We were miles from the nearest town, camping by a quiet lake deep in the forest. My husband, a retired cop, had insisted on coming here. Even at 72, he's strong, and he's always saying he can still look out for himself, and for me. He trusts his gut, and after so many years on the job, he says he can tell when there's trouble nearby. We parked the truck close to the water and set up our small tent right beside it. As night fell, a deep silence settled over the place. It was so quiet that it almost felt lonely, but with my husband by my side, I felt safe. Or at least I thought I did. Around midnight, I woke up with this strange feeling. Something was off. My husband was already awake, sitting up at the edge of the tent and staring out toward the woods. I could tell he'd noticed something too, though he hadn't said anything about it before. The night was completely still. No usual sounds of insects or wind in the trees. It was as if everything had gone dead quiet, like something had silenced the whole forest. He didn't need to say a word for me to understand he was tense. Then we heard it, a crunch like someone stepping on dry leaves, moving slow, careful. It was close, way too close. The sound stopped, then started up again, moving around us. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be circling our tent, staying just out of sight in the darkness. We stayed completely still, listening. The steps grew louder, heavier, with a slow, steady rhythm. Whoever it was, they kept circling, each time coming a little closer. My husband reached into the tent and took out his hunting knife, his hand calm but tight on the handle. He motioned for me to stay low and quiet, and I could see a serious look on his face, one I hadn't seen in a long time. The footsteps stopped suddenly, just a few feet from the tent. Silence hung in the air, thick and heavy, and I could feel my heart pounding. My husband kept his eyes locked on where the sound had come from, not moving, just waiting. Then, out of nowhere, a hand pressed against the side of the tent, sliding along the fabric like it was feeling for something. I held my breath, feeling each finger drag along the side. My husband tightened his grip on the knife, ready to strike if they tried to come in. The hand stayed there for a few long seconds. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I could hear the footsteps slowly moving away, growing fainter until everything went silent again. We sat there, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. Finally, as dawn started to light up the sky, we stepped out of the tent. My husband scanned the area around us, but there was no sign of anyone, no footprints, nothing to show anyone had been there. Just a heavy, strange quiet that felt unnatural. I almost convinced myself that we'd imagined it, but then I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. On the side of the tent, right where the hand had touched, was a dark, smeared mark. It wasn't dirt. It looked like dried blood. And right beside it was a single handprint, pressed so hard into the fabric that it left a deep mark. We didn't wait to find out who or what had been out there with us. By the time the sun was fully up, we'd packed up everything and were driving away, not looking back. But as we pulled out onto the dirt road leading away from the lake, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us go, motionless and alone. It didn't move, didn't follow, just stood there watching us leave. To this day, I have no idea who or what that was or what they wanted. But I do know this, we weren't alone that night. And every time I think about it, I wonder if they're still out there, waiting in the woods, watching for the next unlucky soul to camp by that lake. The thought of it, of that silent hand pressing into the tent, sends a chill down my spine that I can't shake, even now. I planned the camping trip to be quick and simple, a solo night out to clear my head. The spot I picked wasn't far from the US-Mexico border. Not the safest place, but it was quiet and out of the way. I figured nobody else would be around. The drive took longer than I thought, and by the time I got there, the sun was going down. Dark clouds were moving in, and soon, rain started pouring down hard as I finished setting up my tent. The rain beat down in a steady rhythm, blocking out every other noise around me. First, the rain was relaxing. It was just me, surrounded by nature, with nothing to think about but the rain. But after a while, a strange feeling crept over me. I couldn't explain why, but something felt wrong. I tried to ignore it, blaming it on the fact that I was alone in such an empty place. With the rain keeping me inside the tent, I had nothing to do but sit there and listen. Every now and then, I'd hear noises outside. Sometimes it was just the rain hitting rocks and branches, but then I'd hear something that sounded different, like something stepping through the mud. I told myself it was probably a small animal, but the sound was too heavy, and the steps seemed too careful, almost like someone was trying to be quiet. A couple of hours passed, and I tried to relax, thinking I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. But then I heard footsteps. These were slow, heavy steps moving closer. My heart started racing. I lay still, holding my breath, hoping whoever or whatever was out there would leave. The footsteps circled my tent slowly, and through the fabric, I saw a shadow. It was faint, but it looked tall, definitely a person. The rain pounded harder, making it tough to hear anything clearly, but that just made things worse. Whoever was outside was trying not to be noticed, and that could only mean they didn't want me to know they were there. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was wasn't just passing by. Minutes felt like hours as I lay there, frozen, listening to the sounds outside. Finally, the shadow moved away, but my sense of relief was short-lived. Every sound seemed sharper. Every shift of the rain made me think they might be back. I stayed curled up in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, and after a long stretch of silence, I heard footsteps again. This time, there were more of them, and it sounded like several people were moving around just outside. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound, hoping they'd leave. Then I heard one of them whispering, too low to make out the words, but it was clear they were talking about me. Suddenly, the zipper on my tent rattled, and my blood went cold. I couldn't move, couldn't think, just lay there, hoping they'd lose interest and go. The zipper stopped, but then something pressed down on the tent, like they were testing to see how strong it was. A moment later, the weight lifted, and I heard the footsteps fade into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, trembling, waiting for the sun to come up. When dawn finally broke, I packed up as quickly as I could and drove away, not looking back. On my way home, I stopped at a gas station to fill up. The guy at the counter gave me a weird look, probably because I looked exhausted and shaken. He asked if I'd been camping nearby, and I nodded. He shook his head, frowning, and said, "People don't usually camp out that way. Not with all the stuff going on around the border." He didn't need to explain. I'd read stories about smugglers and traffickers, people who didn't want anyone seeing what they were doing out there. As I drove home, I thought about how close I'd come to something bad. I had no idea who those people were or what they wanted, but I knew that if I'd made one wrong move, they wouldn't have left me alone. It's been a while since that night, but I still think about it, and it chills me to know they let me go only because they wanted to. The thought I can't shake is that they might still remember me, that they might be out there, waiting for the next person who makes the mistake of camping too close to that line between safe and dangerous. And I wonder, with a shiver, if next time they won't just walk away. I'd been out in the forest for a few days, working on a project to find a better treatment for snake bites. My work took me deep into remote areas where I knew the risk was high. The plan was to camp close to spots where snakes lived, study how they behaved, and gather information that could hopefully help save lives. That evening, I set up camp a few miles from my car, next to a small stream. It was known to have lots of snakes around, especially rattlesnakes and cottonmouths. As the sun set, I went over my notes by flashlight. The forest around me was quiet, with just the occasional rustle of leaves as night settled in. Around midnight, I decided to get some sleep. I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent, feeling the cool night air coming through the fabric. Just as I was drifting off, I felt something strange, a light weight moving slowly along my leg. My heart stopped, and I knew exactly what it was before I even looked. There was a snake in my tent with me. Slowly, I glanced down and saw the rough pattern of a rattlesnake, its body sliding across my thigh, making its way toward my chest. I lay there, barely breathing, knowing that any quick movement could set it off. The snake moved calmly, its scales brushing against my skin. The flashlight beside me showed its thin, gray scales, and I could see the shape of its head. My only option was to wait. I'd read about situations like this. Panic would only make things worse. I lay there, every muscle tight, barely blinking, hoping it would just keep moving. My mind started racing. I was miles away from help, and if it bit me, my chances of surviving would be low. I thought about my first aid kit outside, which had antivenom in it, but I knew that by the time I could get to it, it might be too late. Finally, the snake paused, lifting its head close to my chest, as if it could feel my heartbeat. Then, as if it decided I wasn't a threat, it slowly turned and started to slither back down. I held my breath, waiting, hoping. Sweat was running down my face, every nerve in my body tense. But just when I thought it was over, the worst happened. The snake's tail caught on the edge of my sleeping bag, and suddenly I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my leg. I didn't scream, couldn't. I just lay there, feeling a burning pain spread up my leg. At that moment, I knew I was in serious trouble. The bite was already swelling, and the pain was getting worse by the second. I forced myself to sit up, crawling out of the tent and grabbing my kit with shaking hands. I managed to give myself a dose of the antivenom, but deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. My leg throbbed as the venom spread. I tried to stand and start walking back to my car, but each step made my vision blur, and I could feel my strength slipping away. The forest around me was dark and completely silent, except for the faint sounds of distant animals. My legs buckled, and I fell to the ground, lying there in the dirt and leaves, surrounded by nothing but shadows. Lying there, I felt the darkness closing in, the venom spreading through me. I was alone, miles from anyone who could help, with only my dim flashlight casting a weak light around me. I knew the chances of making it out were slim, but I fought to stay awake, hoping against hope for some way out. As the darkness grew deeper and colder, I thought about all the times I'd read stories of people in situations like this, thinking I'd know exactly what to do. But out here, alone in the forest, none of that knowledge mattered. The forest didn't care about my plans or my preparations. It was just me, lying there in the dirt, realizing I'd wandered too far from safety. The last thing I remember was the dim circle of light from my flashlight slowly fading, as if the forest itself was pulling me into the dark, swallowing me up without a trace. Out here, I was just another small thing that no one would ever find. I had picked a thick, quiet part of the forest, far from any paths or campsites. It seemed like the perfect spot, surrounded by tall pines and thick bushes that kept most people away. I'd come out there alone with only my axe, a tent, and enough supplies for the weekend. My plan was simple: chop some wood for a fire, relax in the woods by myself, and camp overnight. By the time evening rolled in, I had a decent stack of logs and sticks, enough to keep a fire going all night. The whole area was silent, except for a few rustling leaves or the occasional twig snapping. But as the light started to fade, I got this strange feeling that something wasn't right, like I wasn't alone. Felt like someone might be watching me. I shook it off as just my nerves and kept setting up my tent, getting everything ready for the night. When night fully settled in, the quiet became heavier, almost like a weight pressing down on everything. Every tiny noise felt louder, sharper. I tried to ignore it, sitting close to my fire and warming my hands, telling myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest. But then I heard something nearby, a steady, crunching sound like footsteps moving through the leaves. They would start, then stop, then start again, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard or wasn't sure where they were going. I held my breath and listened hard, hoping the sounds would drift away. Instead, they seemed to move around my camp, slowly circling. At times, they would come closer, then move back into the darkness, and then come closer again. I stared into the fire, my heart pounding, my hands starting to shake, but I couldn't bring myself to look into the trees. I thought it might be an animal, but the steps were too slow, too careful, almost like they were waiting for me to look. Hours went by, and the footsteps kept coming and going, moving from one side of my camp to the other. I stayed tense, hardly blinking, gripping my axe tightly as my hands got sweaty. When I finally tried to get some sleep, I kept the axe close by, lying stiff on the hard ground, listening. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, it was early morning, and the forest had gone completely silent again. As I packed up my stuff, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Just a few feet from where I'd been sleeping, the ground was covered in small, muddy boot prints. They circled my tent, paused right beside where I had been lying, and then led off into the trees. Whoever it was had been standing there, in the dark, just watching me sleep. The whole hike back, I felt like eyes were still on me, like I was being followed. Even when I got to my car and finally drove off, I couldn't shake the feeling. And the thought kept coming back to me. Someone had been out there, close enough to reach out and touch me in the night, but they hadn't. They just stood there watching, waiting, and I still don't know if they'd just let me go, or if they were still out there waiting for me to come back. Camping in the Amazon was something I had always wanted to try, though I knew it could be dangerous. My gym partner, my dad, and I thought it would be an adventure we'd never forget. So we packed everything we'd need and set off into the thick, hot forest, my dog Max right by my side. The trees rose high around us, so tall they blocked out most of the light, and soon it felt like we'd left the world behind. The first day went by smoothly. We set up our tents by a small river, had dinner, and talked about the trip and our plans for exploring. Max stayed close, sniffing around, his ears up and alert. As the sun went down, the forest started to get louder. The sounds of animals and insects filled the air, almost like they were right beside us. It was strange at first, but after a while, the noise almost became background sound, like traffic in the city. When we went to sleep that night, I could barely relax. The jungle had a way of making you feel like someone or something was always watching you. Every little noise, the rustling leaves, branches snapping, made me jump. By morning, though, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks, and I got ready for the day. We spent the morning hiking and checking out nearby trails. The air was thick and hot, and by noon we were sweating like crazy. We headed back to camp to rest, but when we got there, something looked off. Our things had been moved around. The bags we'd left by a tree were scattered, and the tents looked like they'd been nudged. At first, we thought maybe an animal had wandered through, just curious. But when we checked, nothing was missing. Everything was just moved. It was strange, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe animals were just checking out our stuff. Later that night, as we sat around the fire, Max suddenly got up and started growling at the trees. His body was tense, his growl low and steady. He wouldn't stop staring at something we couldn't see. He stayed like that for what felt like forever, just watching. Eventually, he settled down, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't leave. The next night was worse. I was half asleep when I heard a quiet sound, like something was scraping or dragging along the ground. I held my breath, listening closely. Max was awake but staying quiet, just watching. My gym partner moved slightly, sitting up and listening too. The sound got closer, circling our tents. It was too slow and quiet to be an animal. My whole body was tense. I wanted to believe it was just some animal, but then I heard something that made my heart start racing. The sound of footsteps, slow and steady, right outside my tent. I froze, hoping it was all in my head, but the footsteps kept going, moving from one tent to the next. My dad's tent was right next to mine, and I could hear him lying perfectly still, listening too. None of us moved, not wanting to make a sound, as the footsteps circled us, again and again. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The jungle went completely silent. Even the insects seemed to have gone quiet, like the whole forest was waiting for something. I lay there, unable to sleep, just staring into the darkness, hoping for dawn. When the sun finally started to rise, we all knew it was time to leave. We packed up quickly, each of us glancing back toward the trees, as if expecting to see something watching. Max stayed close to my side, his usual energy replaced with quiet alertness. Whatever had been out there, he sensed it too. As we walked back through the jungle, the feeling of being watched never left. Every now and then, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, something shifting in the shadows. I told myself it was just the jungle playing tricks, that there was nothing really out there. But deep down, I knew better. We all did. Finally, we reached the edge of the forest as the sun was fully up, and I felt a huge sense of relief seeing the open sky. But I made the mistake of glancing back one last time. And there it was, a dark shape half hidden in the trees, just standing there, watching. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stayed there, as if it was letting us go but could follow anytime it wanted. Even now, I still feel that gaze, like it never really left. The Amazon might be full of life, but it hides things that don't belong, things that don't want to be seen. And whatever had been out there with us, I know it could have done something if it wanted to. I don't know what would have happened if we'd stayed even one more night, but I have a feeling it wouldn't have let us leave. I remember the time I went camping with my grandparents. We had done it a few times before, but this trip felt different. We were far out in the woods, where no one else seemed to be. The trees were thick, and the air had that fresh, damp smell you get deep in the forest. It seemed like the perfect spot, or at least I thought it was. We set up our tent next to a small, quiet stream. Everything seemed calm and peaceful at first. My grandfather made a fire, and my grandmother started making food. I helped a little, but most of the time, I just enjoyed the sound of the stream and the cool breeze on my face. The night came fast, and the forest around us got quieter and darker. After we ate, we sat by the fire. The fire was the only light in the dark woods. My grandparents didn't seem bothered by anything, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. The silence felt heavy, like something was waiting. It was a weird feeling, and I didn't know why, but I kept it to myself. I thought maybe I was just imagining things. The first thing that made me feel like something was wrong happened when the fire flickered. It was like something blew on it, but there was no wind. Then I heard a noise from the bushes, like something was moving through them. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound didn't seem right. Too heavy, like it was being done on purpose. I stayed close to the fire, telling myself it was nothing. But the noises didn't stop. They got louder, closer. I started to notice something strange. The shadows around the tent weren't moving like they should. The trees weren't swaying at all, but the shadows seemed to shift, like something was moving behind them. My heart started beating faster. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I peeked out from behind the tent, trying to see what was out there, but the trees were too thick. I couldn't see anything. Then the noises came again, louder this time, even closer. I could feel it like something was watching us. I grabbed my flashlight, turning it on and shining it into the dark woods. The beam cut through the trees for a second, and I swear I saw something move fast, just out of reach of the light. It was like it was trying to stay hidden, but I knew it was there. I froze. My breath caught in my chest, and I couldn't move. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noises stopped. The forest went completely silent. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, but everything else was dead quiet. We sat there waiting, but nothing happened. The silence grew thicker, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I finally worked up the courage to check outside the tent. I didn't see anything. The woods were just empty, nothing out of the ordinary. But even though I couldn't see anything, I knew something was off. It felt like the air was wrong, heavy, almost like something was still there, watching. My grandparents went to bed, completely unaffected by what had happened. To them, it was just another night camping. But I couldn't sleep.
I lay there, listening to the silence.
It was a different kind of quiet, the kind that makes you feel like you're not alone, like someone or something is out there waiting. Morning finally came and I was relieved, but that night still haunted me. It wasn't the kind of creepy feeling you get from a story. It was something real, something I couldn't explain. I've never gone back camping in that spot again. But every time I hear the wind in the trees or the rustle of leaves, I think about that night. The woods had felt too still, like they were holding something back. The silence after the noises, that was the worst part. It wasn't a quiet you expect in nature. It was too perfect, too empty. I don't know if it was just the woods being quiet or if it was something more. All I know is that something out there knew we were there, and it didn't want us to know it was watching. I was stationed at the border, in a remote area so isolated that the trees were so thick, the sunlight hardly made it through. It had been weeks of being out there, just me, the land, and nothing else. The place was known for being dangerous with rough ground and the constant threat of people crossing where they shouldn't. But more than anything, it was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was a silence that made your skin crawl, like something was out there watching. That night, I was on my own, which wasn't unusual, but it still felt odd. I was supposed to be on duty, keeping an eye out, but I had set up camp for a bit of rest. The sky was dark, covered with stars, but the woods felt strange. There were no sounds, no animals, no wind, nothing. Just the trees swaying in a breeze that didn't make any noise. It was the kind of silence that felt wrong, like something wasn't right. Something was hiding, waiting. I sat by the fire, poking it with a stick to keep it going. The crackle was the only sound. My flashlight sat next to me, its light flickering weakly. Then I heard it, a sound. It wasn't the usual rustling of an animal, but something more deliberate, like someone was out there. My neck went stiff. I reached for my rifle and stood up slowly, heart pounding, eyes scanning the dark. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but then the noise kept going. It wasn't the usual sounds of wildlife, this was different. Something was moving through the brush, heavy and slow, like it was trying to make sure I heard it. I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of the darkness. A shadow moved by the trees, quick but clear, like a person. My pulse raced. I was alone and I knew it. I stood still for what felt like hours, trying to figure out what it was. Every crack of a branch made me jump. The shadow was still there, moving closer now, and it wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person either. The way it moved was too controlled, too careful. My gut told me it wasn't natural, but I didn't know what it was. The wind picked up again, and the trees made those strange, whispering noises. But there was no usual wildlife.
No birds, no insects.
Nothing. Just an empty, cold stillness. It was as if the whole forest had gone dead silent, as if everything had stopped breathing. After a while, I couldn't just stand there. I grabbed my flashlight and started moving toward the shadows. My heart hammered in my chest with every step. It wasn't fear that made me walk toward it. It was the need to know what was out there. But as I got closer, I smelled it. A sour, damp, rotten smell that made my stomach twist. I nearly turned and ran right then, but I couldn't. Something kept pulling me forward, like I had to see it, whatever it was. Then, through the dim light of the flashlight, I saw it. Not a person, not an animal, but something else. A pile of old clothes, all torn and dirty, and something underneath. It was like someone had tried to bury something, but hadn't done it right. The dirt around it was all messed up, dug up in a way that didn't make sense. The body, or whatever it was half buried, like it had been tossed aside. I shined the light on it, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just the dirt that was wrong. The body, or what was left of it, was arranged strangely. The arms were twisted, the hands turned in odd directions. I noticed marks on the ground, footprints, but not mine. Someone else had been there. I froze. My blood went cold. I wasn't alone. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back at my vehicle, locked inside, engine running. My chest was tight, my heart pounding, but the worst part was the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. I knew I hadn't imagined it. Whatever it was, it had been waiting for me. As the night dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling. The place wasn't safe. I packed up my gear in the morning and left without a second thought. But as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The trees were still, like they had been all night, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I never went back to that place. Not once. The silence out there was different now. It wasn't just a quiet forest anymore. It was something else. I can't explain it, but I know it was real. What I saw, what I felt, it didn't just disappear when I left. It stayed with me, and as I drove farther away, I couldn't help but think that the forest wasn't finished with me. That thing, whatever it was, still knew where I had been, and it would never let me forget. The real terror wasn't in what I saw, but in knowing it was still out there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to come too close.